All right, so we're going to be looking at some complex numbers and simplifying them. First example, the square root, it says simplified, the square root of negative 49. Now, us, before we were talking about taking the square root of negative 9, we would say we can't do it, it's not a real number. Now we have what's called the principal square root of a negative number. The principal square root, square root. So the index must be 2 in order for us to use this rule. It says that we have an index of 2 and the radicand is negative. What we're able to do now is take out that negative 1 factor from that radicand. So we're going to write this as two separate radicals, negative 1 times the square root of a. Now remember, we talked about what happens whenever you have a radical that's a negative 1. Well, please remember, note this in your notes, that whenever you take the square root of negative 1, it's going to equal to the imaginary unit I. So the principal square root says, yes, we're going to take out the negative 1 factor, take the square root of that, which is I, times it to our radical, and then our solution would be I square root of A. Whereas before, we could not find two identical radicals that would give us negative 49. Okay, so what we can do now is take out the negative 1 factor by using this principle. So let's look at the first example and complete that. We have the square root of negative 4, as I said before. We're going to write the square root of negative 49 as two separate radicals, taking out the negative 1 factor. So you're saying the square root of negative 1, which is I, and the square root of 49, which is a perfect square, we have 7. So as we write our solution, just like if this was a variable x in front of the 7, we want the variable afterwards. So our solution here is 7i. And that's all we can do. Now we're able to take the square root of a negative radicand. Example B, the square root of negative 64. Take out the negative 1 factor, the square root of negative 1, and we have the square root of 64. Take the square root of negative 1, which is I. So I'm going to really hound you on knowing this concept here of finding the square root of a negative number, the square root of negative 1, which would be I. Take the square root of 64. That's a perfect square. That is 8. So our solution is 8i. Next example, the square root of negative 3. Let's write this as two separate radicals, taking out the negative 1 factor first. So the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 3. Take the square root of negative 1. That is I, our imaginary unit. The square root of 3. 3 is not a perfect square factor, so the 3 is going to stay under, or a perfect square number, so 3 is going to stay under the radical sign. So our solution is I square root of 3. Whenever you have a imaginary unit I and a radical together, please write the I in front of the radical, not after the radical. Let's do two more of this one. Number 4, we have the square root of negative 45. Okay, so we're going to write this as two separate radicals, taking out the negative 1 factor. Now 45, the number 45 is not a perfect square, so we're going to have to write we're going to have to find factors of 45 where one of its factors is a perfect square. So let's use the prime factorization method where we create the prime factorization tree. And we have here 5 times 9. 5 is prime, break down 9, we have 3 and 3. So let's look at each factor now. Take the square root of negative 1, which is I, and let's write the prime factors of 45. 3 times 3 times 5. We have a pair of 3's. We're going to bring that on the outside. And with the 3 being on the outside and the imaginary unit I being on the outside, our solution is 3I square root of 5. And that is all we can do. We've done everything possible. Number 5. 2 square root of negative 18. You're saying 2 times the square root of negative 18. So let's take out the negative 1 factor. So we have the square root of negative 1 and the square root of 18. 18, let's break down. We have 2 times 9. 2 is prime. Then we have 3 times 3. So let's bring the 2 down. Tell me the square root of negative 1. What is that again? I. And then let's write the prime factors for 18. 2 times 3 times 3. We have a pair of 3's. Bring it on the outside and take the 3 and multiply it to the I and to the 2. And our solution is 6I square root of 2.